All right, hello everyone. Oh, let me put on my microphone here. Hello everyone, welcome back to Historical Geology 1404. Today is not glove sensitive touchpad here. Today is lecture 10. We are going over the next step in the geologic timescale, which is the beginning with the Cambrian. Okay, so we ended the Precambrian on Monday. We're moving into the Cambrian. There we go. Moving into the Cambrian. Yeah. But before that, any questions or stories? Interesting things at all? Anything we want to talk about?
Oh, I saw a TikTok yesterday.
Okay, hit me with the TikTok.
Wait, let me find it. It was something about wait. Wait, sorry. I have to find it. Something about like shooting stars yesterday.
Uh-huh.
Something like that.
Meteor shower?
Yeah,
Meteor
that-
shower. Yeah. Yeah, so right now our orbit is taking us through, what would you call it? More or less a debris field, okay? Yeah, so we've had a significantly increased amount of meteor showers worldwide over the last couple of weeks, and a couple more weeks we'll move out of it. But yeah, really beautiful meteor showers right now. Lots of stuff falling out of the sky. I'll see news reports, people saying, I found a meteorite in a hole in my backyard. I'm like, yeah, I believe that. I believe it. Good thing it didn't land on your house. But yeah, good call. Anything else? It is cool. Anything else? No? Any questions about the rest of the class? We're down to 1, 2, 3, 3 more days of lecture before finals week begins. Did you guys get the official "this is how graduation week is going to work out" email yet? No? So because we're having graduation every night on the week of graduation, that whole week has been deemed graduation week, and I'm not entirely sure what that means for class sessions yet. They haven't seen fit to give us any more detail than that. But I'm still planning on meeting together for an exam review that Monday, and then our movie night on Wednesday. Okay? Because it's still part of the semester. The semester doesn't technically end until that Wednesday or Thursday. It's actually Thursday, I believe, is the end of the term. Okay? So what that means is your final exam is going to be due that Thursday night, so that Friday I can come in and grade everything. Normally that would be so that all final grades can be turned in before graduation, but again, we're having 9 graduation ceremonies this year, so it's just going to be turned in when it gets turned in. Just make sure all your work is in no later than Thursday at midnight. Okay? And again, that's 2 weeks from tomorrow. Okay, so I'm just letting you know a little bit forewarning. All right. Everyone graduating on Friday or Saturday here?
I think Saturday.
Saturday? There's no Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday graduations in this room? All right, good. I recused myself from Tuesday because that's when I have my PhD class in the evening. And I'm not skipping that. I'm not getting a bad grade in my PhD class to be at that graduation ceremony. So that's the one I will be missing. But I'd hate it if I missed out on seeing any of you guys graduate. Glad it sounds like I won't. I know that some gown pickups have already begun. They sent us an email asking for more volunteers to help with gown distribution, though. So more of it is still happening. I just don't know when you would need to go get yours. Yeah. maybe worth checking your email, and if it's not there, maybe calling your advisor. Those important dates also should be listed somewhere on the OC registration website, okay? Whatever the web page is where you go to register or get information about the registrar here, all of those important dates should be listed there as well. Okay, good questions. Anything else? No? All right. Well, let's go ahead and begin. One last thing I will say, real quick, a little bit of a self-plug here, but tomorrow is the final day of this round in the America's Favorite Teacher competition. I'm still sitting at second out of the top 5. Only the number 1 spot will move forward to the final round. So if you have some time, I'd appreciate a vote or two between today and tomorrow. And we'll see if I can push through to first. I don't know how many votes there are between me and first place. It's been like this for about 2 weeks now, where the same lady, the same teacher, has been ahead of me. And I've been in second. So there could be 1 vote, there could be 1,000 votes between me and her. Maybe she has a really rich friend who bought a bunch of votes for her. I don't know. That's kind of the unfortunate fact about this particular competition is it's unfortunate because people can just have rich friends that buy votes for them. But at the same time, all of the money goes to the Planetary Society, and I can't really be mad about that because the Planetary Society does really good work for spreading space science around communities. So there you go. All right. The Cambrian. So we left off with the end of the Precambrian at about 500 million years ago, 541 million years ago. Now, why do we cut it off there? Well, because a long time ago, people thought that the first evidence of this, what we call Cambrian explosion, this massive increase in biodiversity across the planet, began 541 million years ago. But what have we learned about the fossil record? It is incomplete. We only have what we have. We can only see what we can see, right? So it makes sense that every now and then we're going to find some fossil evidence that kind of throws a wrench in what we previously thought we knew. And that's exactly what happened here. So the line was drawn at 541 million years ago, but since then we have found things like the Ediacaran fauna in Australia. That's 570 million years old, right? Which is a part of a big explosion in diversity before that 541 mark. But it takes a while to move things like this, and so eventually the Cambrian may get pushed out that far, but for now we're still sitting at 541, okay? Now, the term we have for this is the Cambrian explosion, okay? Why do we call it that? There wasn't an actual kaboom, right? No bomb went off. But there was a massive increase in the number of and variety of organisms that lived during this time, okay? Excuse me. A lot of the modern day phylum, which remember we've got our kingdom, order, phylum, class, things like that, okay, in our taxonomic breakdown of each organism, okay? A lot of the modern phylum show up during this time. Some of them that show up during this time are going to die off, but a lot of them make it through to today, okay? We see the use of minerals to grow things like skeletons during this time. No longer is it just kind of a crusty mineral framework or exoskeleton on something like a tiny little sponge, or no longer is it a mat of algae, right, that has sediment and algae just caked on top of each other. Now we're seeing actual organizational mineral crystal growth to make structures, okay, biological structures for support of a body, okay? Now, there's a lot of theories for why this could have been. It almost certainly comes down to our good old evolutionary war, right? Our what do we call that? The arms race, right? The evolutionary arms race, where one animal or plant has one adaptation that gives them an advantage, and then the thing that preys on that or is preyed by that has to then adapt to match or become better in a certain way. That arms race that I called it, the development of these skeletal elements was probably due to that sort of interaction. It became necessary for survival of a species or several species in several different ways. Some of them started growing skeletal elements on the inside. Some of them started growing them on the outside, etc. Okay? Now, we can tell a lot about the chemistry of the ocean during this time, and therefore things like the temperature and acidity of that ocean, by seeing what that ratio of calcite to aragonite is. And I mentioned this before, where aragonite is a little bit of an unstable, a little bit more of an unstable variety of calcite. And so when we look at the ratios of organisms made with calcitic elements to organisms made with aragonitic elements, okay, that can tell us a little bit about the general state of the ocean during that time, which can in turn, by the way, tell us a little bit more about the atmosphere as well, because we know what the interaction between the atmosphere and the oceans are today. Okay? A little bit of that principle of uniformitarianism, applying principles we see today to that then, and then reapplying that to things today. Okay. Some other things that we see show up during the Cambrian. Bigger sponges. We saw the earlier sponges, the individual kind of on their own pre-massive colonial sponges, okay, back in the Precambrian. We see the large colonial sponge communities show up during the Cambrian. Mollusks, okay, so our mollusks include things like brachiopods, bivalves. Later on, nautiloids. We're going to see some nautiloids here in a little bit, okay. After that, ammonoids, okay. Trilobites, which are a type of arthropod. You remember our trilobites? The kind of bug-looking ones, these guys over here, right, that can roll up to protect themselves. Talk about those more here in a second. And then echinoderms, those show up during this time as well. The shells that we saw in our lab that have the 5-point symmetry, like sea stars and sand dollars, things like that. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about trilobites. Trilobites are really important in the fossil record. Why? Do you remember why trilobites work really well for certain aspects of paleontology?
They're found for a very long period of time. They all look very different comparatively.
Okay, so as a group, they have a very long fossil record. As individual species, they have very short fossil records, and they're very obviously different from each other. What are all those characteristics of? What would that make this organism? An index fossil. Remember, the criteria for being an index fossil, something we can rely upon to use for things like fossil succession studies, okay? We need to be able to tell those things apart from each other, and there has to have been enough of them to have been preserved, and there has to have been a large enough distribution of them that we can use them to correlate across distance. Trilobites fill like every single one of those, okay? All right, so they make great index fossils. They also represented the beginning of some very important adaptations that we still see in organisms today because they were so successful. What are some character traits that you can see in this picture of a trilobite and in the trilobites that we've looked at before that might give trilobites a really cool advantage? Okay, those horn things. What do you think those horn things were for? Some of them have pretty cool head ornamentation is what you're talking about. What might those have been used for? To fight. I'm just imagining two little trilobites at the bottom of the ocean, like ramming each other with their head spikes, like, I don't know, like a mountain goat. I don't think that was likely. Very likely not. But what else might they have been used for? Come on, camera, stay with me here. Navigation, how do you mean? Camera, come on, what's up?
Just imagine them using it to figure out
A wall? Oh, I see. So like some sort of sensory apparatus. Yeah, that's a possibility. Why would it be hard for us to tell if that's the case, though?
Because aren't most of like the little things for navigation usually done through nerves, and then that kind of difficult for it to kind of like fossilize since like
Okay, now we're getting to the point I'm trying to make. Not necessarily through nerves, but what's the point you're getting at right now? What were you just saying?
that it can't fossilize,
What can't fossilize?
like the nerves or like the little things.
It's an example of what? Soft tissues. Bingo. Way to tie that together. Perfect, yes. If it is some sort of sensory apparatus, hard to tell because the soft tissues that would be involved in that no longer present. Now, we have organisms that have similar sort of sensory organs. Slugs and snails have eye stalks that come out the top of their heads, all soft tissue. If such a thing existed on a trilobite, we wouldn't know it. Okay? So that head ornamentation may have had some sensory thing, even if it was only like a bumper, even if it only functioned like a car bumper, where you hit something, it's like, oh, can't go that way, and you turn and you go this way in the real dark parts of the ocean. Sure, that may have had a function. Hard to tell, though. The ornamentation on these things is so wide and varied, though. Normally, when you see that sort of crazy ornamentation on an organism, it has some sort of variational purpose. A very common one we see, sexual dimorphism. Does anyone know what that means? What does the term sexual dimorphism mean? Okay, so it has an aspect of appealing to mates. Sexual dimorphism is when you can tell two different subgroups of the same species apart. Males and females, for example. Okay? How can you tell human males and human females apart? There are a few distinct biological differences, right? How do you tell a peacock male and a peacock female apart? Yeah, the feathers. The males have those gigantic feathers to display to attract a mate. It's an example of sexual dimorphism, okay? So this may have been an example of that. It may also have functioned as a form of defense. Enough of these things are spiky enough and sharp enough, they very well may have deterred certain types of predators from trying to eat that organism. Okay? They could have been multi-purpose. They could have done both, right? Yeah, no reason why I couldn't have done both functions. Who knows which one came first? Maybe it's neither. Maybe someday we'll find out. But these are the interpretations we make, again, by trying to look at the world that we have today and interpret things from back then. Okay. They have not just those spikes, not just the head ornaments. They also have their armor. Their entire body is armored, right? Pretty significant. And this is why trilobites stuck around for so long in the fossil record. They went from 541 million years ago all the way up until when the dinosaurs showed up. Trilobites, dinosaurs, there isn't really an overlap there. Okay, they died off at the end of the Permian, beginning of the Triassic. We'll get there next week. Okay? But another major adaptation that we see here. Eyes. Yes. Were these the first organisms to have eyes? No. At least, probably not. Not sure. Okay? But you know what they did have? They had compound eyes. Look at this. This is a trilobite eye right here. Okay? It kind of looks like a jelly bean. One on each side of the head. Do you see these little bumps there? Each one of those is an ocular cell. Now, they couldn't move their eyes. Their eyes were not adjustable. They sat on their head. But because each one of these essentially is acting like a camera lens, and this is a curved surface, each one of these is pointed at a slightly different angle. It's like having a telescope with 80 camera lenses on it, and you never have to move your telescope. You can just get 80 different images that your brain puts together around you. Very interesting. Fantastic advantage. Think about the field of view this thing had. What kind of field of view did this guy have? He could see up, He could see that way. He could see this way. He could see behind him. Look at this eye. He had eye cells pointed this way. He could see behind him. It's a little bit of a problem here, though. Which way couldn't he see? He could see up. Look, there are cells on the top of the eye. He could see above him, which was a big advantage because most of his biggest predators come from above, right? You see a predator coming from above, what do you do as a trilobite? You curl up and get that spiky, hard armored shell. You turn into a sea urchin looking thing, right? Okay? So where couldn't they see? It's down. They had no way of looking down. And very likely, they also had a blind spot right in front of their face, right? Because the eye is over here, the eye is over here, and they've got this big old snout in the way. So they could probably see like this and like this, but a blind spot in front of their face and most definitely down. Okay? We see some predators that develop later on to be ambush predators. Okay? I'm going to hide under the sand and snatch things up that swim or crawl on top of me. This actually still happens today. There are octopi and fish. Flounder, right, will hide in the sand and snatch things that come up from above them, or that come above them, okay? They will blend into the sand or hide just underneath the sand so that they can catch things. They'll just be there and then whoosh, snatch it like that, okay? Still happens today. All right, so that's our friend the trilobite. Anomalocaris was the apex predator during the Cambrian for a long time. This is another arthropod. You can see the similarities that it has to trilobites. Hard armored exoskeleton, segmentations. This one couldn't curl up into a ball, but it could ambulate. It could flex its body with its segments doing this sort of motion, allowing it to do this remarkable thing called swim. Okay, think of the way that a sea snake or an eel moves through the water. It's essentially what this thing is doing. Okay? Now, another cool thing that made this, two other things that made this the apex predator was the ability to swim, sure, but also look at its eyes. What do you notice about its eyes? Yeah, it's got those eye stalks. And these are compound eyes just like our trilobite friend. Okay, the advantage here is they are offset from the body. They are on stalks above the head. Much wider field of view. Okay, much wider range to see. Okay, another big advantage. These things got about 6 feet long, by the way. Okay, which is just a little bit longer than I am tall. I am 5'10". Okay. I don't know if... Is Tinder even a thing anymore? I was about to make a Tinder joke. I was going to say 5'10" in reality, that's 6'2" on Tinder, right? Yeah. I don't even know if anyone uses Tinder anymore. It was a thing when I was in college. All right. But yeah, no, about 6 feet long. And you look at these jaws, okay? These appendages right there. Those aren't teeth. Think of those as like armored tentacles with spikes on the inside. What function could those serve? Why would you have two giant armored tentacles with spikes just outside your mouth? The mouth, by the way, right here, basically just a hole that had some grinding, crushing, teeth-looking things in there. They weren't actually teeth. They were pieces of the carapace, pieces of the shell that it would flex together to crush things. But why would you have... The mouth couldn't close either. It would like vacuum up. It would vacuum up its food. But why would you have those appendages in front? Huh? To hunt? How would it make it easier to hunt?
Kind of like the elephants, you know how they use their tusk. Is it tusk or I don't know what it's called, like their nose?
Oh, the trunk.
Yeah, to like kind of like get food.
Exactly, for grasping. The Anomalocaris would come above its prey, brachipod, bivalve, even trilobite, scoop it up out of the sand or whatever it's on with its two appendages, and then squeeze and squeeze. And the shells would crack and break under the pressure of the squeeze, plus those teeth-looking things on those appendages would pierce and break, right? And so it would crush its prey and then vacuum it up with its open mouth there under its head. And that's how these things would hunt. Really, really kind of sketchy, scary way to think about it, but really only if you're an invertebrate that can't run away or not get away fast enough. These things would never have been a danger to you and me because, I mean, it's not going to, can't squish me. It might hurt me, but, these things would never hunt you and me. So, scary to think about if you're a shellfish, right? Not that shellfish do much thinking that we're aware of. What an awkward day that would be if we found out, huh? All right. So that's your apex predator, your top of the food chain, Anomalocaris. Then we have the beginning of these eocrinoids. We've talked about crinoids a little bit in my class. I've described them as these kind of sea lily looking things, these underwater flowers, where they've got stalks made out of calcite that come up from an anchor, and then they've got these flower looking things on top called a calyx, right? That just catch food out of the water and bring it down to the mouth, and then catch food and bring it down to the mouth, right? We see the ancestors of those. They are called eocrinoids, and they show up in the Cambrian. Later on, we'll see a lot of crinoids living together in large communities, but for now, we just kind of find them as isolated, solitary organisms early on in their evolution, okay? Our stromatolites used to, for, 1.5 billion years now? More, possibly? Our stromatolites have been the only game in the ocean that we know about, right? They were all over the place. We had reef systems made out of stromatolites. But now, they are suffering. They are having a problem. Why? Well, because normally, when a new organism shows up, it's because it has adapted to something. And one of the most common adaptations is a food source. As we go through our evolution of organisms through time, our stromatolite populations go from being the only game in town to a buffet lunch. Okay? So our trilobites and a whole bunch of other organisms are eating. They are grazing on these on these stromatolites. So we see stromatolite populations during this time plummet. They start really suffering because they're the target food source for a lot of these organisms. Matter of fact, towards the end of the Cambrian, we see stromatolites pretty much are only in tidal zones. Okay? What does that mean? Where the water comes in and it comes out. Because most things haven't learned how to live in atmosphere yet. Stromatolites, they don't mind being exposed to oxygen for a little bit. The water comes right on back. But pretty much anything else has not evolved to that point. There is nothing living on land yet, guys. Everything's still in the ocean. Land is a barren, rocky landscape. There's no plants. There's no animals. There's no bugs. There's nothing. Think of, our land probably looks something like Mars. Earth probably looked a little like Mars with kind of reddish, tannish, grayish looking continents and ocean. Oh, but that's going to change here in a minute. All right. So, during this time, because the stromatolites are suffering and they are moving further tidal to tidal zones, so next to land, okay, we see archaeocyathids and sponges start making the newer reef systems. And remember, a reef is a community of organisms that lives within the photic zone next to a continental shelf or on a continental shelf, okay? All right, now, some really cool things, besides the ones we just talked about, some really cool things started showing up in the Cambrian. I've been talking to you solely about this type of organism we call invertebrates, specifically marine invertebrates. What is an invertebrate? No backbone. No spine, specifically. Backbone, this might be a little semantic at your point. A backbone is a collection of vertebrates, of vertebrae, I should say. But you know what their function is? Yeah, it helps us stand upright, but you know why it developed in the first place, because obviously things didn't start off standing upright. Yes, to protect the spinal column. The first spinal column that we see in the fossil record was present in this organism called a pikaia. Okay? This pikaia had what we call a notochord, which was kind of a stiff cartilaginous tube that the rest of the musculature in the animal connected to. It was an early backbone and spinal column all in one. Okay? It provided the structural stability for the organism, allowing it to move faster, more efficiently. Okay? Have individual motion options. Okay? You see also the development of these fins, these early fin-looking things. It was able to manipulate those because of its muscles that were attached to that notochord. Now, this also served as an early nervous system, central nervous system. This is the first of what we can truly call the vertebrate ancestors. Okay? There's the possibility that there are ones before this, naturally. But again, we can only go with what we know, right? Okay. So let's talk about the geography and the environment during the Cambrian. Okay. So our supercontinent during the Cambrian is Pannotia. Okay. But as time moves on and the Cambrian is about to end, we see Laurentia separate itself from the party, leaving the supercontinent of Gondwanaland. Okay. So Gondwanaland is our supercontinent at that point. Laurentia has left the party. Okay. Now, I mentioned last time we met that there were certain things that you had to take note of for a future exam. Okay? I told you about cratonic sequences. Absolutely take note of those. Okay? I told you about orogenies. Absolutely take note of those. This is your first cratonic sequence that you need to make note of. Okay? Both orogenies and cratonic sequences will be something you want to have in your notes. Okay? So, the Sauk cratonic sequence occurred during this Cambrian time period. What is it? This is when the Earth was really warm, okay? It was during a period when Earth was really warm, and when Earth is really warm, waters, the oceans, the levels, elevations are really high. So look at this. Laurentia is this big, but only that green section was above water during this time. What does that mean? All of the rest of this is flooded and therefore getting sediment deposited on top of it. And this is a cratonic sequence. A cratonic sequence is when there is major deposition, typically because it is underwater. Okay? Sediment will flow out off of the continent and be deposited off the side of the continent. And that's what's making our cratonic sequence. Okay? So, because of all of this different life, we see major fluctuations in Earth's environment, okay? The different gases that are being expelled by these new forms of life, particularly the photosynthesizers. The reef systems are having an effect on the environment because of the massive amounts of life that are present there, okay? So all of this meant that there was quite some environmental back and forth and back and forth. There are 6 extinctions that occurred during the Cambrian. Is what I'm getting to here. 6 extinctions. We lose some things, we get some things. Trilobites always come back. Trilobites always come back, rediversifying to newer, crazier shapes and sizes. At the end of the Cambrian, that last extinction, the 6th extinction, was the largest, and this makes the dividing line between the Cambrian and the Ordovician. The Ordovician started 485 million years ago and went to 443 million years ago. Trilobites, this is the hardest hit that they have been yet. Okay, they do make a comeback. Okay, they come back real strong. I don't know that I could say stronger than ever before, but because they have to, this is the thing, when something goes extinct, or excuse me, not extinct, when something gets hit real hard by an extinction, but still sticks around, the spaces that that species or group once occupied rapidly fill with other things. Do you remember what we call that? Irradiation, an evolutionary radiation. So while the trilobites are still recovering, other things go and fill some of the niches left behind by those trilobites, okay? So every time this happens, there's always the risk that something that was a very strong contender before doesn't quite make it as far the second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth time around, okay? That's something that you'll see as we continue through this timeline. Graptolites. Graptolites, that's a particular fossil that you saw in a lab. Hopefully you've done your lab 3. Graptolites is a fossil in your lab 3. They look like this. Now the sections of graptolites that we still have in fossils are kind of these sections of, it kind of almost look like tentacles here. And sometimes we'll get these tubes. They are very similar in concept to like a sea anemone, okay, where you've got your body here, the mouth at the top, and these tentacle tubes bring food down into the mouth, okay? Graptolites are around for a while, but they are not still alive today. They die off here in a little bit, which makes them great index fossils, which is why they're worth mentioning. Nautiloids. All right. Nautiloids are these organisms that have these curled shells. They are cephalopods, which means that they are mollusks that have all of these different arms or feet, I should say. Okay? Cephalopods that have all of those propulsion and clambering and grasping arms. Okay? Now, nautiloids came with a fascinating and very important evolutionary advantage. They had a new way of maneuvering themselves, transporting themselves. They didn't need to undulate like Anomalocaris and Pikaia, right? They didn't crawl around on the ground like trilobite. They didn't sit in place like crinoids or brachiopods or bivalves. They came with a brand new way of locomotion, jet propulsion. That's right, they had rocket engines on their butts. No, they didn't. No, they had the first form of jet propulsion we know of in the fossil record. They would suck water in their mouth and then spit it out a tube, and that would propel them in the opposite direction. Okay? The first biological jet propulsion. Now, what kind of advantage does that give? Huh? Much more mobile. Why would you want to be mobile? In what situations would you want to be more mobile? Escaping from a predator or catching your prey. Bingo. And jet propulsion helped with both of those. Okay? So they became much more efficient predators and much more escapable prey. Okay? Now, they didn't start off with these nice curled shells. We'll see the curled shells show up later in the fossil record. They had long, straight, kind of spiky-looking shells, which made them a lot more hydrodynamic as well. Okay? Now, because of their success, these things went all over the place. We have nautiloid shell fossils on every continent for pretty much the rest of the fossil record. Okay? Now, they are almost extinct today. Do you know why? Give you a hint. This is a nautiloid shell. Look at the inside. What does it look like? What does this inside of this shell remind you of? If you could use one word to describe this, what would it be? It's pearly. Exactly. Do you know why that looks like pearl? Exactly. That's essentially what it is. It is a thin layer of the same stuff that makes pearls that's on the inside of that shell. How do you make a pearl? You get a piece of sand or some other debris caught inside of a shellfish, usually an oyster is where we'll get pearls from, okay? And then that oyster, because of that little bit of aggravation inside of its shell, that oyster is going to, I guess you could say salivate, the same sort of stuff on top of that piece of grit that it uses to build its shell from the inside. That's how shellfish do their thing. They build their shell from the inside out. And so it's going to deposit layer upon layer upon layer of the same silica-based saliva that turns into shell on top of that grit, and that's how you get the nice rounded pearls inside of an oyster. Well, the same sort of process is happening on the inside of this shell. And that's why we would call this mother of pearl. That's where you'll get mother of pearl jewelry, is from nautiloid shells and other similar shells, okay? Human hunting of nautiloids is a big part of the reason why they're nearly extinct, because they've been used for millennia, literally millennia, by humans for jewelry, okay? Ocean-faring civilizations have caught these things and turned them into earrings and necklaces for thousands of years, okay? Now, also climate change has had an effect on their population. They were already weak to begin with, but we certainly haven't helped matters. Okay, so very, very strong contenders in the food chain. These nautiloids have become. Okay, so by the time the middle of the Ordovician rolls around, we see about triple the diversity that we saw early on. Okay, so life has come back in a real big way here. Okay, during this time, if you want to survive, you have a shell. That may be a bit of a biased interpretation of the fossil record, though. Why? Bingo. If I said, okay, this might be a bad example, but if something happened in this room and everyone that was wearing a black shirt survived, but the rest of us did not, and then someone later in walked in and saw only people wearing black shirts, they'd be like, wow, this room was full of black-shirted people, right? That's not true. It's just the people that were wearing other colors of shirts are no longer here anymore, right? That's the sort of example that's going on here. We can only say organisms with shells were the strongest survivors. Organisms with shells were the highest in the food chain. Organisms with shells were the name of the game. I can only say that because the organisms with shells are the ones that we have the most fossils for, okay? But that is fossil record bias, because hard parts will preserve better than the soft parts, okay? Just want to make sure that we don't lose track of that here, okay? But nevertheless, our fossil record is made almost entirely out of those hard-shelled organisms, okay? Our crinoids have become more colonial at this point in time during the Ordovician. We see large groups of them essentially forming massive communities underground, or not underground, underwater, okay? During this time, we will see vast fields of crinoids out there. This is not the best age for crinoids, though. That is coming up. Okay, that'll be during the Carboniferous. We see more crinoids during the Carboniferous than any other time. But they are becoming very successful here during the Ordovician. We see our reef systems begin to transition out of our archaeocyathid sponge system, more towards what we will call a coral system, actual corals. Corals being a whole new type of animal here in the game, okay? Brand new type of organism that has joined the party, okay? Coral reefs, or coral strome reefs is another term that you'll see for those, start to show up here, but they are not the modern day corals you and I have in our oceans now. If you go swim at the Barrier Reef, you're not going to see any of these types of corals out there. During the Ordovician, there are rugose corals, which you may remember from lab. Those are the ones that kind of look like the sad, droopy ice cream cones, right? The kind of cone shapes that have a curve to them, okay? Rugose corals, okay? Also known as horn corals for obvious reasons. Then you have tabulate corals, which you also saw in your lab. Those are the ones that make like the hexagonal columns that are joined by bridges from one tube to the other, okay? Each column represents its own kind of growth of that colony, and they are joined by these horizontal tubes, okay? It almost looks like a city of skyscrapers with sky bridges between all of the buildings, okay? That's your tabulate corals. Then you get stromatoporoids, which are essentially the same sort of thing as our stromatolites. Whenever you see oid or operoid or anything like that, that suffix at the end of a word, it means beginning of the word like. So when you see stromatop, you might think, oh, stromatolite. Think that concept, but the oid at the end means like that, but a little different. Okay, that's what oid means. So, or id. Id also can mean that, okay? That's another Latin suffix. So stromatoporoids, very similar in concept to stromatolites, but slightly different, okay? In as much as these ones kind of were not the same organism exactly, and therefore were not targeted the same way that the older stromatolites were, okay? And so they were able to be incorporated into this reef system. Bryozoans show up, and they also kind of make their own communities. They are in with the corals to an extent, but they rely on a lot of the same food sources, and so they kind of make their own little sub-reef systems as well in slightly different environments. All right, those bryozoans. And then this is where we see our first sea stars, right? They show up. Boom. By the way, these guys, vicious predators. You guys ever thought of starfish or sea stars as predators? Oh yeah, these things are brutal. Starfish will slowly crawl their way over to a snail or a bivalve, like a scallop. They will crawl on top of it, suction cup down on top of it, anchor themselves to that thing, and then they'll open up their little mouth in the middle, and they have a little mouth drill. And they will drill their way through that shell until they can pierce through it, and then they will slurp out the yummy insides from that shell. So if you ever go to the beach, I spent most of my childhood at the beach. I found a lot of shells like this. You pick up a shell, and there'll be a little hole inside of it. You think, oh, starfish food. Yeah. Okay. All right. Our stromatolites are well and truly excluded to those tidal zones now because they are the bottom of the food chain if they are not in those zones. And there they remain. To this day, our stromatolites that live, we have a few of them left, and they are almost exclusively in tidal zones. A lot of the ones that I can think of are in Australia, okay? Still hang out in Australia in the tidal zones there. The places where it's either really salty or there's not enough water for their typical predators to come and eat them all the time. Now we see a lot of different extinctions during the time. Take a look at this. Every time you see an increase in this graph, in this line on this graph, that means that there is more diversity. Okay, see on this scale the number of genera, which is the plural of genus, right? Then on this side, this is time. Okay, so going from down here, which is the Cambrian, we see some pretty good diversity, and then there's that major extinction there. And then during the Ordovician, oh, increase, extinction, increase, extinction, increase, oh, big extinction. And that's the one right there at the end of the Ordovician. Okay? But look at what happens to life over time. Oh, man, that's a pretty major extinction. The largest extinction in Earth's history. We will talk about that. But then what happens? Look at the massive increase in diversity since then. Extinctions serve a purpose, not one that is intentional. Okay, although that leans a little bit more towards the conversation about a deity and such. But there is nothing intentional about an extinction in and of itself. But it does serve a purpose in nature. Anything that can't cut it is removed, which means that as time goes on, the organisms that are capable of adapting become more adaptable. Now, there are plenty of scientists who might dispute that, but I would argue the evidence is right here. Their argument would be fossil record bias, right? The closer we get to modern day times, the more fossils we have of the animals that have lived most recently. The further away we get, the less fossil record we have. That also has a valid point to it. But I would rather argue with the data we have than say the data we don't have is the strongest advocate, right? So with that in mind, I would say, yeah, the fact that we have such a massively increased amount of diversity, extinction after extinction after extinction means that this extinctions effectively work as a whole towards making life on Earth more adaptable. I don't mean it's making it better, right? I don't think I could stand in front of a T-Rex and say, ha ha, you suck, I'm better than you, and not get eaten, right? It would eat me. I don't think that evolution makes things better over time necessarily, because that's a matter of perspective. I think it does make things generally more adaptable, though, because we have this long record in our DNA of adaptation. Okay? Just a thought there. All right. Now, I've talked a lot about animals. Let's talk about a little bit of a different part of our phylogenetic tree here, okay? Way further back, before the Cambrian even, there was a separation of bacteria that would go on to become animals, bacteria that would go on to become plants, and the bacteria that would go on to become animals, what would become animals eventually, split off from there as well into what we call fungi. You remember I told you that we are more closely related to fungi than fungi are to plants, right? Fungi are closer to animals than they are to plants because we split off from each other more recently than we did from plants, okay? So there have been fungi living in the oceans at this time as well. Think of them as kind of like underwater mushroomy looking things. But here's the thing. Fungi spread via spore. A spore is essentially, it's this tiny little genetic package, microscopic genetic package that must remain wet constantly to survive. Only in moist environments. To this day, mushrooms can only survive in moist environments, which is why you'll see them pop up in your lawn after it rains a lot of the time, depending on where you are in the country. Okay? But those spores need that water to survive, which means that these fungi would spore out underwater, and then the fungi would get carried away and plant themselves somewhere and start growing. Well, during the Ordovician, we start to see fungi spores start getting washed up on land and start growing there. Some mutation occurred which caused them to not need the constant presence of water. Yes. The fossil record shows us land was owned by the mushrooms first, basically. Okay? Mushrooms made that first step, so to speak, of a permanent presence in a land environment. Now, they didn't remain being the only ones there for long. We'll talk about that later. Who likes eating mushrooms, by the way? Really? Only 2 of us? 3 of us? Man. Mushrooms are great. Love mushrooms on pizza, mushrooms in pasta, mushrooms in salad. Oh, so good. Have you ever tasted a mushroom, those of you that like mushrooms? Maybe those of you that don't like mushrooms. Have you ever tasted a mushroom and thought, oh, I don't like that texture, or oh, I kind of like that texture? It's probably because your body recognizes it as being a substance closer to yourself than a plant, right? There's actually a whole bunch of people that have studied this concept. Why do we use portobello mushrooms as a steak substitute? Because a lot of people, particularly interestingly enough, those who are vegetarian, right, claim that it resembles most closely the taste and texture of meat. Might be something there as far as our genetic similarities. Anyways, yes, okay, so mushrooms, their spores wash out onto land, and they start growing on land next to the water, where the waves kind of, wash up and lap up next to them. So they still have access to water, but they are planted, they have rooted themselves on land environments now, okay? All right, so Ordovician, where are we at tectonically? Baltica is moving. It's leaving the party and going north, okay? So it's no longer part of Gondwana land. It's moving up here. Then we see something else happen. A strip of land separates itself from the edge of South America and Africa in Gondwanaland, this is still Gondwanaland, okay, separates itself and moves out west. We call this strip of land Avalonia. You guys ever heard the term Avalon? Where does the term Avalon come from? Emma should know this one. Emma, do you remember the word Avalon? Does that sound familiar?
Avalon?
Yeah,
Like from our play?
like from our play. 2 years ago, Emma and I were in a play about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And Avalon is the mythical kingdom where King Arthur went to rule after his death. I was King Arthur in that play. Spoilers, I did die. And I was carried away to Avalon. Avalon is this place in British mythology where essentially think of it as sort of like heaven. If you turn the British kingdom into heaven, that's their perception of Avalon from this myth, okay? Which is why King Arthur rules and reigns there. Why did we call this place Avalonia? Well, because this is what would later go on to become the British Isles. Okay? This goes on later to become most of what the British Isles are today. Now, it did something really cool during this time. It does a flyby. It takes animals and plants that have evolved in Gondwanaland and basically lifeboats them across the ocean to Laurentia, which has been separated for tens of millions of years and undergone its own set of evolution. So we got Gondwanaland organisms migrating across the ocean on Avalonia and doing a flyby of Laurentia. How do we know this happened? Because all of a sudden in the fossil records, when Avalonia gets real close, it never actually hits, but it gets real close to Laurentia, all of a sudden we start seeing fossils from Gondwanaland over here, even though Gondwanaland is still on the other side of the planet over here. So, very, very interesting scenario. When that happens, it makes what we call exotic terrains, an exotic fauna. Okay? Exotic, something different, something not natural, something not evolved in that zone. When Gondwanaland things jump from Avalonia to Laurentia, we see that show up in the fossil record. Very, very cool to see that. Okay? Now, this is part of what we call the tectonic orogeny. So this made a set of mountains in eastern, what would become the eastern US and Canada, okay, eastern Laurentia. This happened because as Avalonia is moving its way out west, it's coming real close to the east coast of Laurentia and making those mountain ranges form as it pushes island arcs into Laurentia, and the near pass of the two tectonic plates causes the creation of the tectonic mountain range, okay? So that's the tectonic orogeny, all right? Then there's the Tippecanoe cratonic sequence. So this happened basically at a period of warming during the Ordovician, but it did go all the way through the Devonian. Okay, so what happened here is, let me go back to this image, the tectonic mountain range that formed out here as a result of the flyby of Avalonia. Okay, that mountain range starts to weather down. Where does that sediment go? It starts getting washed inland, which is currently flooded because of how hot the world is right now. There's like no ice anywhere during this time. Okay, so because there's no ice, sea level's high. Sea level's high, a lot of Laurentia flooded. A lot of Laurentia flooded, the sediment that's getting weathered off of this brand new mountain range goes down into that shallow sea in the middle of Laurentia and makes what we call the Tippecanoe cratonic sequence. Okay. Any questions about the Ordovician before we move on? Okay. Let's talk the Silurian then. So here's our Cambrian, here's our Ordovician, here's our Silurian, and then Devonian. We're going to stop after the Devonian today. But the Silurian, right here, 443 to 419 million years ago. The extinction between the Ordovician and the Silurian is the second largest that Earth has ever seen, as far as we can tell. It's a pretty big one. What caused it, though? That is a great question. Still, largely a mystery. There are some theories for what could have caused it, many of them compelling. The most interesting one, though, because there's not a lot of evidence for what could have caused this. All of a sudden, we just see life on Earth take a steep dive. There's an extinction for not anything that we can really tell could have caused it. Sure, there was volcanism. Sure, there were a few impacts from celestial objects. Nothing that can, on its own, account for why we would have an extinction this big. There is a very interesting theory, though. A gamma ray burst. Do you guys know what gamma rays are? That's how Bruce Banner turned into the Hulk. He dosed himself with gamma rays. Although I've always found it very interesting how a gamma ray, which is a beam of radiation, how he somehow managed to turn that into a green potion that he injected himself with. Not quite sure how he did that. Fun fiction, though. No, dosing yourself with gamma rays will just melt you. It won't, it'll rip you apart at the genetic level. It'll absolutely destroy you cellularly. It won't turn you into the Hulk. Please don't try it. A gamma ray burst is caused by a star when it goes nova. So let's talk a little bit about a star real quick. Okay, so here's our star. Okay. Stars go through this R sequence, okay? This R process of making gradually heavier elements over time. Eventually, what you're going to end up with is a star that has a lot of iron in it, okay? It cannot produce anything heavier than iron or more massive than iron. So it's going to build up the quantities of the heavier stuff in it until it no longer has enough fuel to burn hydrogen, okay? When that happens, one of two things can occur. Either it's going to expand into a red giant, red because of the wavelength of light it's giving off, because of the lower energy it's producing, okay? Not as hot as what we have now, okay, but significantly bigger. Eventually, one day, our star is going to become a red giant, and it will expand so big that the outer edge of our star, our sun, is going to be approximately where the Earth's orbit is right now. That's how much bigger a red giant is going to be. So when that happens, it's either going to just kind of cool off and drift apart, leaving behind or slowly spreading cloud of all of the particles that it made. Or it goes nova. What does that mean? Essentially, there is so much mass in my star that it's making so much gravity that all of a sudden our star collapses in on itself instantaneously. And the energy released by the instantaneous collapse of a star in on itself creates what essentially you can only describe as an explosion, okay? That instantaneous collapse under the force of gravity releases so much energy. That energy is manifested in the form of radiation. So it's going to blast particles out in every which way, but it's going to send out gamma rays. And the most typical way that we see this happening, if I remember correctly, is you get these distinctive cones of gamma rays that shoot off from the different poles of your star, like that. So you're going to get gamma rays that shoot off in that direction and gamma rays that shoot off in that direction. Now, our universe is full of stars. It's full of stars that are constantly going supernova, which means that there are constantly beams of these gamma rays flying through space. The statistical likelihood that any one of them could strike our lowly little planet here is very small, but still possible. So here's the thing. All of a sudden, life on Earth takes a nosedive. Boom. There's no reason for why we could see that happening in the fossil record. But you know what would not leave evidence in the fossil record? Gamma ray burst. So that's why this is the most interesting possibility for what could have caused this extinction. A random gamma ray burst from a supernova that happened hundreds of millions of years before, probably, flying through space, encountered Earth, blasted it with gamma rays, annihilated a ton of the life here, leaving behind only what survived, either in the deepest parts of the ocean or on the other side of the planet. That's the theory. Again, statistically small possibility, but we don't really have much evidence for what else could have caused it. So, interesting situation. This does raise a concerning question, though, doesn't it? What's that question? Could it happen again? And would we see it coming? Gamma rays fly at the speed of light. We see things at the speed of light from space. But can you see a beam of radiation coming at you head on? Don't know. I actually don't know. We see broad spectrum light all the time, and we can interpret it to do things like spectroscopy and things like that. I actually don't know if we've been able to observe something like a gamma ray burst from a head-on angle before. Do you know? I don't know. Yeah, and by the way, even if we could see it, what could we do about it? Nothing. We could be like, oh, shoot, our technology is developed to the point where we can see where that supernova happened 100 million years ago. A gamma ray burst is flying right at us. It's supposed to hit us in the year 2892. I guess we have 870 years to figure out what to do about it. There's nothing we can do about it right now, right? It's about as good as it can get. And that's if we had that technology to be able to see that coming. So, all right. Okay, so 60% of all the genus or genera and about 85% of all species on Earth were lost in this extinction. And remember, this is only the second largest extinction. If that sounds bad, just wait till we get to the end of the Permian next week, okay? Our friends, the trilobites, they almost bite the dust. Enough of them pull through, though, that they're able to re-diversify and refill those niches again to an extent. Again, each time other things manage to take a few more niches from them, okay? But they still stick around and they're still significant index fossils. As a result of this extinction and the ensuing radiation, brachiopods not only re-diversify in the ocean, but we see them actually move up into fresh water. So we've got mushrooms moving up onto our beaches, and we've got brachiopods, shellfish, moving upriver. Okay? The invasion of land is slowly occurring. Okay? Our graptolites come back in a really big way here. Okay? They fill a lot of those niches. They occupy a lot more living space. We see the number of graptolite fossils increase by 5 times what it was before, okay, in the Ordovician. Hi. What's up? Yeah, right here. Okay. You know where to find the rest of this. It'll be on YouTube. Yeah. How you doing, Faith? Good. It's good to see you. She was in my class last year. All right. Okie dokie. All right. Eurypterids. This is a Eurypterid. He kind of, let me erase my supernova here. Phrases you only hear in my class. All right. What does that guy kind of look like to you? Huh? Kind of like a lobster. Huh? Trilobites? Okay, so this is an arthropod like trilobites. And it does kind of look like a lobster. It also kind of looks like one other thing. Scorpion. Yes. Most commonly when people look at this, they're like, that's like a lobster scorpion. Those are the two things that it's often compared to. And I agree. Okay? I mean, lobsters and scorpions all are descended from animals like this, right? They are the modern day descendants of arthropods like Eurypterids and trilobites. Okay? That's why they share similar characteristics. This is a Eurypterid. This became an apex predator during the Silurian. This was essentially a scorpion, so it had the claws and stuff. It would capture its prey, no stinger, anything like that. Nothing developed like that yet. But it did capture its prey in its claws and eat it like a scorpion would today. Emperor scorpions do not often use their stinger. They'll usually catch things in their claws and then just eat them because their claws are so big. That's actually why I want to get an emperor scorpion for class that I can hold here like this. Just let them crawl around on me and stuff. They almost never sting because it's something that they've evolved out of because their claws are so big that they can just catch whatever they want to eat and crush it. Okay? So it would be really cool for like moments like this when I'm talking about arthropods and I'm talking about segmented shells and the ways that they can move and their claws and the way that their limbs are oriented and stuff like that, to be able to have a scorpion that I can show you guys just like I do with the snake. Would that be a step too far? No? You'd be okay with the scorpion? Yes. Would you hold it?
Probably.
Ah, look at you guys. We've come so far. Okay. All right. Now, Eurypterids were not only dominating in the ocean, they also were moving into freshwater as well, and not even just on freshwater. With those legs, you don't just have to stay in water. They have a pair of fins on the back here for swimming. Those weren't very good for swimming, though. Those are meant for walking. We have trackways of Eurypterids on land. So, finally, an animal is moving out of the water and onto the land. Remember, we still don't have plants yet. Isn't it kind of crazy to think about animals walking on land before plants were on land? And yet, fossil record seems to suggest that was the case.
There wasn't any plants like even in the ocean.
In the ocean, there are. In the oceans, we've got algae, right? We've got, I mean, the closest thing it would come to, I show you a picture of this later. It's called liverwort, which is a gross name, I know. But it's a non-vesicular plant, okay? Not vesicular. Vascular. I was like, wait, wrong word. Okay, non-vascular plant, so it has to stay in the water. There were a bunch of those in the ocean. Plants did exist in the ocean during this time. They were in the food chain. They were getting eaten, right? And they were photosynthesizing and doing all that stuff, but they hadn't moved out onto land yet. Okay, we will get there. Then we see the first fish, okay? So these first fish came from those, that Pikaia I showed you earlier, the one with the notochord, the earliest spinal cord, right? That Pikaia would, as a result of the radiation from these extinctions and all that stuff, move on to become the next group of vertebrates, the early fish, okay? So these are ostracoderms, okay? Ostracoderms, these are the fish. They have their columns, their spinal columns here, which allow them to have things like tails so that they can swim and use their fins for directional movement and things like that. But they were also armored so that they could measure up in that arms race against the other things that were preying on them, okay? There's always a bigger fish for any of those Star Wars fans out there, right? We also find these in fresh waters, okay? Freshwater is becoming that new prime real estate. The oceans, that's pretty filled up, but freshwater ecosystems, those lakes and those streams and those rivers, still pretty wide open. And so we see all sorts of organisms going to live in them. This is what the general evolution of fish looks like over time, by the way, okay? So here during the Cambrian, we get our jawless fishes, okay? So we've got our Pikaia going on here, okay? Then we have the Ordovicians show up, and we see the earliest fossils of what may have been the ancestors of these other groups. Whenever you see a dotted line like that, there's like a strong maybe of a fossil record, but nothing quite confirmed yet. But now we're in the Silurian, and so we've absolutely got groups of fishes. Heterostracans, osteostracans, anapsids, right here, placoderms. Oh, we'll talk about placoderms in a minute. Acanthodians, they show up here as well. We'll talk about those. The modern day fishes we have, though, because all of those are extinct now. The modern day fishes that we have, lungfishes, coelacanths, ray fin fishes, which are most of the fishes that occupy our oceans, Rays and sharks, lampreys, hagfishes, those start showing up here in the Carboniferous. Okay, all of those ancestors start showing up here in the Carboniferous. Okay, so continuing our conversation about the Silurian, we're going to talk about placoderms now. And acanthodians. Acanthodians are kind of the next iteration of what we see in fish, where the ostracoderms and the heterostracans were very heavily armored. We see a new type of fish show up on the scene. One that isn't heavily armored, kind of lightly armored, but has a lot of fins. What would that suggest to you? It doesn't care so much about having armor. It doesn't care at all, actually. Evolution has pushed it in a direction not of being heavily armored, but being what? Faster. Yeah, more fins, stronger tail, less armor, faster. Now, this is also one of the first examples of a jawed fish. What advantage would a jaw give? Huh? Pressure? Oh, crushing. Yeah. Our Anomalocaris needed tentacles to capture its prey, right? Our Pikaia and our other jawless fishes would need to swim over its prey and slurp it up real quick before it could get away. Jawed fishes still don't have any limbs that they can use to capture their prey, but what they do have is still the ability to grasp something. How did we go from jawless fishes to jawed fishes? Do you know where the development of the jaw came from? What an interesting evolutionary adaptation.
In shells. In crushing into shells.
Good thought, though. No. Jaws came from gills. I'm going to show you that change here in just a second. But I want you to look at this real quick. Watch this video. Here's a great white shark. Very similar to what we saw in the design of that acanthodian a minute ago. Don't do it to me. This computer. I don't know if I can make it to December. December is when they said they would replace it. I might just swipe it with a sword at some point. All right. Okay. Look at those jaws. Look at those jaws with all those teeth. Similar in design to yours and mine, with a few key differences. Okay? But what I wanted you to see in that video is that the jaws appear right here, and what's immediately behind the jaw? The gills. Yeah, check this out. Okay. Here are the gill bones in a fish. Gill bones, gill bones. This is the gill bone that has turned into the upper jaw support bone, the lower jaw support bone, and then this is the lower jaw and upper jaw in a modern day fish. Those are gill bones that evolved to swing up and down for grasping. Now, there was no teeth to begin with. They didn't have the teeth, right? They didn't start off with massive shark jaws. They started off with 90-year-old grandpa jaws, okay? They weren't gumming their food to death. They were just grabbing it. Because remember, food didn't get away as fast back then, right? So the earliest jawed fishes had gills that evolved to allow their jaws to move up and down. And eventually it went from the bottom of their head out to the front of their head. And so then what's the next step? The next step is teeth. Okay, well, how do you get teeth? Those acanthodian fish, they didn't have the hard shells. They had very light armor. Scales. This is where the first scales came from. Okay? Scaled fish. They were one of the first scaled fish, as well as being one of the first jawed fish. Scales are essentially, it's what I said earlier, very light armor. Okay? that it grows on its outer surface to protect itself. It can't protect itself from too much, right? Scrapes and bruises, not a piercing attack like a tooth, but it still helps. But on that the bottom and upper jaw, where the scales go down into the mouth, those scales eventually became very helpful for grasping prey. Okay? It would grasp the prey using the scales for support. And eventually, a mutation occurred that caused the scales at the mouth to get bigger, sharper. And the fish that had that trait were far more successful than the ones that didn't. And this is how evolution works, remember? Successful traits get passed on. And so the more successful predators, the ones with the heavier, sharper, better for grasping, scaled denticles, we call them, at the mouth area, became the best predators, which meant that they were able to spread their genes more. And eventually, you end up with where you are. Toothy, jawed fish predators. Okay? And by the way, that's where your jaws and teeth came from too. This is the development of the first jaws, the first teeth, that will eventually go on to become ours. We'll continue that story in a little bit here. But I want to tell you a little bit about placoderms first. Okay? Placoderms were the largest, scariest apex predators in the ocean during this time. This is a skull from Dunkleosteus, the largest placoderm we know of. Okay? It's a 12 to 14 foot long fish. And this is all head armor. This is its skull. It had armor for its eye. These are not teeth. That is skull bone armor that has evolved to fit together perfectly like puzzles. Have you ever used crafting scissors, or have you ever seen your mom use crafting scissors? The scissors with the weird triangles in them? Yeah? How smoothly, how easily, how sharply those things cut. Absolutely shearing through anything, right? That's what these guys did. One of the strongest bite forces that we know of in nature, and with armor teeth that would fit together like crafting scissors. There's no way for us to confirm this, but by looking at the size of the skull, by looking at how sharp those bones in the jaw are, how well they fit together, and the size of the musculature needed to move all of that, we estimate that these things probably could have bitten through a car. One of the strongest bite forces that we know of in nature. Okay? This thing would snip through its prey like nothing. Okay? Placoderms. Dunkleosteus, that was the specific species here. Okay? Now, they didn't last very long in the fossil record. They die out at the end of the Devonian. RIP. But they lasted long enough to make quite the impression, because these are some extremely important adaptations that we see there. Okay? I used to work at a museum in Utah that had a skull of Dunkleosteus just like that above the front door. I could have fit my entire body inside of its mouth. Just like mouth wide open. I just like lay inside of it. Just like cut me in half if it wanted to while it was alive. Okay, we already talked about that. Now let's talk about our plants. It is now, during the Silurian, that we start seeing plants move out to land. So mushrooms have been out there for a while, our fungi. During this time, we see animals like eurypterids slowly making their way out there, right? Now plants. Now plants are trying to join the party. Now what's held the plants back thus far has been vascularization for the most part. They need to be in the water to receive the water that they need for survival. But you add the mutation, you add a mutation that allows them to pump water through their systems. They no longer have to be in the water the whole time. Okay, that's all well and good. But I mean, they're basically seaweed. They've just needed to be buoyant. The buoyancy of their bodies, of their organisms in the water is what's keeping them upright. Okay, now we get the development of cellulose. Okay, you remember I told you about cellulose? That rigid structure, that kind of honeycomb-looking structure inside of plant tissues. It's that honeycomb structure that allows them to remain upright. That keeps trees from falling over. That keeps your flowers from just being wet puddles on the table. Okay? the development of cellulose structures and the development of vascularization in these plants during the Silurian is what lets them move out onto land. Now, they still have to stay pretty close to the water initially. They do move further away as time goes on. They have to stay close to the water because very similar to fungi, the plants at this point in time spread essentially through the same sort of spore network, the same sort of spore structure that the fungi do, okay? There are no seeds. Those come on later, okay? All right, so in the Silurian, our tectonics is looking like this, okay? So we still have Gondwanaland down here. Here's Laurentia. Baltica has kind of joined the party. Baltica, which will go on to become Eastern Europe, right, has joined this side of Laurentia to make this one big mass. It's part of Laurentia right now. Look at how much of Laurentia is underwater, right? That's our Tippecanoe cratonic sequence still going on, right? Okay. Very warm. We get a lot of carbonate deposits here because of the vast quantity of life forms that are living in these warm, shallow seas, particularly over Laurentia and on the coast of Gondwanaland here, and in interior Siberia, because this is all covered in water. It's warm, shallow sea over that, perfect for the development of carbonate platforms. Any questions about the Silurian before we move on to the Devonian? Okay. Some of the largest reefs that we see in all of fossil history come from the Devonian. Corals do really well, particularly the horn corals. Horn corals, which we call, they're kind of on their own. They are their own individual colony, but they appear in very large groups. Individual colonies occupying a very large area, okay? Those become very, very big components of the reef systems during the Devonian, okay? During this time, the ammonoids show up, okay? Remember, our ammonoids look very similar to our nautiloids. They have different shell, how do I put this? Shell structures. They still have that same sort of coiled shape, and this is during this time is when we do see our nautiloids take on more of a coiled shape. But because ammonoids, which did come from nautiloids originally, because ammonoids are a much stronger contender, they are far more adaptable. From this point forward, we see nautiloids take a back seat, okay? Nautiloids no longer have the biggest advantages. Ammonoids get far bigger. They get far more aggressive, it would seem, in the food chain. They become far more widespread across the world. Nautiloids still exist, and in the end, they get the last laugh because ammonoids go extinct with the dinosaurs, and the nautiloids are still here today. But from this point to that point, from this point all the way to the end of the Cretaceous, we do see nautiloids take that back seat, okay? Okay, so we see that progression right here in the fossil record going from straight shells in our nautiloids and ammonoids to our gradually taking on that curled shell. Every now and then, a shell that looks like this will make its way into one of our local rock shops here. And you're like, oh, I would love that. Because it shows the transition between the straight shells and the curled shells. And I only have straight or curled shells, right? I don't have the transitions yet. But these things are so rare and cool, they go real quick and they're really pricey. These things are like $600 or $700 a sample. And I can only, really? Are we still on that? Okay. I can only get things up to $300 for the department. So it's usually outside of my price range. Okay. Our first sharks show up in the Devonian. So our things like our fish like acanthodians have had long enough to develop the larger fins, the larger teeth, and become what we would identify today as a shark, okay? Ray-finned fishes, which are the ones that we see in our oceans today. Things like salmon and trout and bass and all of those things, okay? Tuna, those are ray-finned fishes. They show up during this time, okay? Not those species, but the type of fish called ray-finned fish, which essentially is the bones in the hands, or in the limbs, I should say, of your fish become long and thin, and there are long, very, very, very thin tissues joining them together, becoming the fins that can spread out and capture more water, right? Like the ones we have today. Okay. Then we have lungfishes. What do you suppose a lungfish is? Come on, it's obvious. Someone spit it out. It loves to bring air? Is that what you said? Oh, lungs to bring air. I thought you said it loves to breathe air. I'm like, I don't know if it would have loved that, but it could. These are fish with lungs. And yes, we still have those today. Okay, these are fish that can go onto land for a short period of time and breathe, or that will come up to the surface to breathe if the water quality is not sufficient for their lungs to get enough oxygen out of the water. Okay. Then we have lobe-finned fishes. A lobe-finned fish is one where instead of having those thin bones that have the thin tissues that allow them to swim easier, they get thick, fleshy nubs on top of thicker bones. Now, these fish are not very fast swimmers, but they will typically spend their time along the bottom of the ocean, pushing themselves along with those kind of fleshy, nubby fins instead. Now, what happens when you have a lobe-finned lungfish? Ooh, that's what we'll see come up happening next. Okay. By the way, this is a coelacanth right here. This is a lobe-finned fish. Look at its fin here. It has a little bit of a fin there, but it's a thick, fleshy sort of fin, and so is that one. It can use those to push itself along the bottom of the ocean. Coelacanths have a fossil record going all the way back to the Devonian. Does that look like an artist's representation? It's not. That's a real picture of a real coelacanth. We thought these things were extinct until, I want to say, what was it, the 80s or 90s? Someone pulled one up in a net off the Philippines. And it sent the scientific community into an uproar. They're still alive, and since then we've sent submarines down there to these deeper trenches off of the Philippines. Lo and behold, we have found coelacanths. By the way, it's not just the same type, it's the same species. The exact same species has been alive since the Devonian. Man, what adaptable creatures these things are, right? They've survived that long. That species has been around since the first organisms started walking on land. Pretty cool. Okay. So, the plants. Let's talk about those plants. We went from having these non-vascular, non-rigid structure plants to having vascular, rigid structure plants, and now they are diversifying even more into what we would call sort of tree-ish looking things. So we've gone from small plants to trees, more or less. And these trees eventually are going to diversify and become more structurally sound, woodier. Early plants, like trees, were not made out of wood, what you and I would look at and say wood. You know when you take a rose, have you guys ever got a rose for a loved one and like you snip off the bottom or you break it open before you put it in water, or you're just like being mean to the flower and you're just like breaking it open? What does it have? It has that hard outer kind of crunchy exterior and then a soft kind of milky white pulpy interior. That's what these early plants looked like. Even the trees, such as they were, right? 10, 20 foot tall, essentially rose stem sort of things. But we go from that kind of pulpy interior to a more woody tissue by the end of the Devonian, okay? All right. Then there is an extremely important adaptation that happens here. The seed. Why would a seed be a massive evolutionary step forward? Huh? What did we have before? The sort of spore-looking things, right? Like what modern-day ferns do. Ferns don't have seeds. Ferns will make a pod, and then a bunch of spores will spill out and be carried by the wind, and as long as they land somewhere pretty wet, they will grow, which is why you'll find ferns in wetter climates, not drier climates, right? But now we have seeds. What is a seed? It is a hard-shelled, protected genetic package. Think of like a sunflower seed or a pine seed, right? A pine nut. An acorn, right? Hard-shelled, protected from the environment until the conditions are right for it to sprout. What would this allow? What would this let plants do? Huh? Yes, they move inland. Why? Because they have seeds which are protected from the environment. They no longer need to remain near water to make their population grow. Seeds let plants move away from the water. And this is where we start seeing inland forests show up. Those early plants start moving further and further inland. The seed, what an incredible adaptation. Massive for the development of plant life on the continents. Okay? Matter of fact, after the Devonian, when we move into the Carboniferous, we call it the Carboniferous because of the massive quantities of plant life that lived on land. Okay? Leaving huge coal deposits. We'll talk about that then. Now, these early trees, we tend to refer to these, a lot of them were in this classification we call lycopods. They wouldn't have looked like modern day trees. They had their kind of stem structure, but then instead of having like leaves at the top, because leaves hadn't evolved yet, they had this kind of sort of mossy structure, okay? Filling the same function, photosynthesizing, doing all the same stuff, but through more of a kind of stringy, mossy structure like it would have had underwater when it was once like an algae, maybe a holdover from kind of like an algal structure. Leaves come later. Leaves do the same thing. They absorb sunlight, right, for photosynthesis? But they have more surface area. And that's the adaptation that leaves bring. It's essentially the same structure, the same function as that moss sort of thing, but you increase the surface area over time to become more efficient in the process. That's what leaves did, okay? All right, going back to our animals. Terrestrial animals specifically. All right, our arthropods have moved out onto land. Eurypterids set the example. Other arthropods followed. Millipedes. Those flightless insects, okay? Like millipedes, centipedes, things like that. We see those move out onto land, okay? Although I should say, yeah, it's close enough. Insects, millipedes are not insects. They're different. Arthropod. Okay. Then we get scorpions, which are direct descendants of our eurypterids, right? Those centipedes, spiders, those carnivorous sort of things. They are making their own ecosystem, but they could not have moved out onto land if the plants had not first. Why?
Because they wouldn't have anything.
Food chain. You follow the food chain, you stay where the food is or you die. So, plants move on land, the animals follow. Plants move inland, the animals follow. Then we see something remarkable happen. Those lobe-finned lungfishes I mentioned earlier, they start moving out onto land. What do you call a fish-like creature that can breathe air, has to remain in water for a lot of the time, but is capable of moving onto land?
I'm guessing
It's an amphibian. It's exactly. My little froggy friends I've got over there. Okay? They must keep their skin wet, or else they die. They must lay their eggs in water, or else their eggs dry out and die almost immediately.
Did they sort of place water in the eggs, right?
In where?
In the eggs instead of.
Oh, we'll get there. We will get there. Just you wait. Okay? But for now, the remarkable thing that happens is amphibians show up. These are direct descendants of those lobe-finned lungfishes. And for a long time, we kind of went from the fish to, oh, then there's amphibians. Where's the middle? Where's that missing link? Then we found it, okay? This is Tiktaalik. This is the actual bone, the actual skeleton of Tiktaalik, and then this is an artist's rendering based off of the bone structures. Look at that. You've got your fin feet. You've got your fish/amphibian-looking head, right? A long body, clearly good for swimming, but limbs clearly meant for walking. This is that missing link between those lobe-finned lungfish and our amphibians, okay? So, this is a lobe-finned fish right here. Look at these wrist bones, these three main wrist bones, your orange one and your blue and your green one right here. Then, later on, there's Tiktaalik. Okay, well, we can clearly see those three bones still, but how did they switch orientations and how did all that happen? Here's Tiktaalik right here in the middle between the two. Okay, clearly showing an extension, a thickening of these meant for holding more weight, pushing the body along. And then eventually, these two bones rotate around so you can actually have your weight on the front part of your feet as you push yourself forward instead of kind of shimmying yourself like this. Okay? This is the first vertebrate to come on land. Became an amphibian. And then everything else, including us, followed. Okay? That's a story for another day. Let's talk a little bit about the tectonics and the climate of the Devonian. Here we are. Early Devonian, still with Gondwanaland. Man, that continent just won't give up, okay? South America and Africa were really having a good time with each other over here, okay? So there's Gondwanaland. Laurentia has become what we would kind of think of as Euramerica, still generally, I mean, the continent is still Laurentia, but it's going to become Euramerica, where this is that Eastern Europe section right here. There's Greenland over here. This is going to be America. What will become America and Canada is still mostly underwater in this section. Okay. At the end, well, before I get to the end, let's talk about what leads to the end. Because remember, there has to be an extinction at the end here. The extinction, at the end of the Devonian was caused by an ice age. What do you think caused the ice age? Oh, why would the plants do that?
Because they're taking more of the carbon dioxide.
Bingo. Same reason why those chemosynthetic and photosynthetic bacteria from billions of years ago changed the climate. We are in a new evolution of life on Earth. Earth has finally started the process of balancing itself out. Okay, right? I'm kind of getting used to this thing called life on me right now. I have found a good sort of balance. Well, then all of a sudden plants start moving out on land. What are they doing? Photosynthesizing the crap out of the atmosphere, right? Sucking up all those greenhouse gases and pumping out oxygen like there's no tomorrow. Massive forests inside of the continents equal massive releases of oxygen. Depletion of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Boom, bada boom, we get an ice age. That ice age ends up killing off a bunch of stuff, as they typically do, and that marked the end of the Devonian, okay? Our placoderms died off here. Those giant armored fish like Dunkleosteus. We lose a lot of our corals, too. Horn coral, tabulate, etc. Okay? All right. The Acadian orogeny happened on the east coast of North America, of Laurentia, okay? Now, this is where I'm going to give a little bit more detail about these orogenies. I'm going to tell you which side of Laurentia they occur on. If you see here Appalachian, that means east coast. If you see Cordilleran, that means west coast, okay? So the Acadian orogeny was an Appalachian, aka East Coast, orogenic event that happened when Laurentia and Baltica and Avalonia collided here. Well, in the case of Avalonia, it did kind of this near miss and then came right up close, okay? So here is Baltica. Here is Avalonia, which will become England and Scotland one day, okay? It's going to come up right here, and it's going to make our Acadian orogeny right here, a new mountain range right there as a consequence, okay? Then we have the Antler orogeny happening here on this side. A series of island arcs collided with the western coast of Laurentia, made that mountain range there. And then right here in the middle is the Kaskaskia Cratonic sequence. This was the period of warming that occurred before the end Devonian Ice Age, okay? During that time, a whole bunch of sediment was deposited out here, and because it was pretty deep, it was anoxic. Anoxic, not free, there was no free oxygen, right? Which means that you didn't get as much organic decay in the things that died in that water. And so the stuff that died in that water was preserved in the sediment, which made black shale. Do you remember what we get out of black shale? Huh? Huh? Not coal. You're on the right track. Black shale is the source rock for oil. So we get a lot of oil out of the black shales that were left behind as a result of the Kaskaskia Cratonic sequence during the Devonian. Okay? Devonian oil will come from that. Okay? All right. Any questions about today's lecture? Cool stuff, right? Seeing our continents and life on Earth kind of evolving along with each other. All those, the different changes we saw in both of them now getting tied together.
Do you think there's ever going to be a way to find out, like, the soft tissue?
We do get soft tissue fossils every now and then. Does anyone remember the name that we give deposit of soft tissue fossils because they're so rare? Lagerstätten. A Lagerstätten is what we call it. It's a German word for whenever we find the soft tissues. And we occasionally will. We'll find worm tissues every now and then. We will find, every now and then there's chemical traces of things like blood. Okay? We've even found the imprints of dinosaur skin. I know. That's how we know what dinosaur skin looked like. How when you look at an artist picture of this, like, well, how do we know it kind of had that scaly, marbled texture to it? We found imprints of it, right? Now we can't tell color or anything like that, right? That's just all up to the artist's interpretation or imagination. But things like skin texture, we've been able to find. Rare, but we have. Good question. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, I will end the recording here.